Thanks everyone for coming to our webinar on cold housing, the impacts on indoor temperature and overheating on mental health. Today we're hearing from two members of the Climate Change Place and Mental Health Incubator, Associate Professor Lyrian Daniel from University of South Australia and Dr. Kimberley O'Sullivan from the University of Otago. Unfortunately, because of timing and teaching commitments, Lyrian was unable to be here in person, but she has shared a video of her presentation and is really happy to take any questions after her by email or through chat afterwards. So never fear, you'll hear from her. I might just skip to the next slide if that's okay. Great. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which this webinar is taking place, and their continuing connection to land, waters, and country and community. I'd also like to extend this acknowledgement to the lands that everyone is joining us from today. I'd like to pay my respects to people, their cultures, and elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any lived experience in the room today, the virtual room. We'd like to acknowledge the unique journey of people with lived and living experience of mental health challenges and the intersection with housing. We'd like to recognise the complexity of people's journeys, their strength and effort to achieve a positive future from a place of hope. We acknowledge the lived experience of families, loved ones, friends, kinship groups and community, and the challenges and successes they encounter in their life journey. So just in case this is your first time coming to one of our webinars, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the incubator project and the kind of things that we work on, and I suppose our major goals. So we're a cross-disciplinary program that aims to understand the impact of housing and neighbourhood design on mental health in the face of climate change in Australia, and to find where housing and neighbourhood design can negatively and or positively contribute to the impact of climate change on people, their communities, and where they live. And although you probably can't see it in this video, I'm actually extremely pregnant at the moment. And so this will be my last webinar hosting for a while, but you're in for a treat because we're going to have a rotating program of guest conveners from the incubator. So experts in urban planning, in kind of social work, in homelessness, in housing design and policy, in political economy, across the board, who will host, I suppose, guest webinars of interest. And so you are in for a treat in the next 12 months or so, maybe less. But if you do have any suggestions for webinar topics that are in this area that you'd like to hear about, please email us because we're always looking for kind of cool ideas and cool people to hear from. So be in touch. All right, so back to the topic at hand. And first we're going to hear from Associate Professor Lyrian Daniel. Before I start, I should also say, and I don't want to forget, that if you've missed out on any of our previous webinars, we have a YouTube channel where you can access these, and we'll send this link around to you all after the current webinar today. But also, you could be able to kind of catch up on anything you missed today in case you have to leave early or you want to hear a bit more or share with your friends. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentation, so please put any questions you have in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screens. And so we'll start off with Lyrian's video. And while Jackie's doing that, I'll give a bit of an overview of Lyrian and her bio. So Associate Professor Lyrian Daniel is a research-intensive Associate Professor in Architecture and Enterprise Fellow at the University of South Australia. Her research is principally concerned with housing, the environmental performance of the built form, the impact of its quality and condition on the well-being of residents, and its fundamental role in supporting healthy and fulfilling lives. Lyrian's work spans basic, applied, and policy-focused research, which has been supported by a number of grants from the ARC, NHMRC, and AHURI. And I suppose a thing that's really important to mention is that Lyrian and Kim are really the superstars in this space globally. And so we're really lucky to have them here today and on the incubator. So you're in for a treat.
Hello. Thank you, Marley, so much for the opportunity to speak today. And I'm terribly sorry I couldn't be with you live for this webinar. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about a little bit of research I've been doing with colleagues on cold housing, as well as its impact or its importance to mental and physical health. So in Australia, we probably have this self-perception of ourselves as the sunburnt country. This perception has been persistent really since settlement of South Australia. And it really, this persistent self-perception as a summer country has expressed itself in research terms as well. So we think about our climate and our buildings and our homes often in terms of how they might perform or be comfortable in summer, rather than perhaps all year round or indeed in terms of winter. So in about 2017, together with colleagues, I was looking at data on housing conditions generally, but then also looking at temperature conditions in homes, and realised that we had very little data on how our houses are in wintertime. Most of our research up until that point had really focused on how our houses perform in hot conditions, and particularly thinking ahead to issues of climate change and warming temperatures or warming climates. So when we started to look around for, I guess, data on what kind of conditions are within our homes in winter, we didn't really find very much at all. There were one or two papers, but they generally weren't of observed data. They were just starting to tell the story. So an interesting paper that started to give a little bit of insight into this issue for us was this international study by Gasparini and colleagues. So this was released in 2015 in The Lancet and made a lot of headlines at the time. So really what this study did was to try and attribute excess mortality to different temperature conditions throughout a year across several different countries. And you can see the countries represented in the graph on screen. So Australia was included in this study, and what was really interesting for us is that the proportion of excess mortality attributable to cold conditions, and in particular moderate cold, was far higher than that attributable to warm conditions. So this was really interesting, and I guess it points to something that we started to see that in the international research is this cold housing a problem, even in very mild climate countries, places that we wouldn't normally expect. So at the time, this study made media headlines in Australia. And I guess some of the reason why we might see such high mortality in Australia because of cold conditions was our housing, or housing was implicated in this. And this is really where the term glorified tents has come from, or was popularised. So you might see headlines at the start of winter talking about how Australian homes are no more than glorified tents. So I guess from perhaps a cultural perspective, this is a little bit surprising because we think about ourselves as a summer country. But then when you really look at sort of the climates that we have, maybe this is not so surprising. So most of Australia's population live in temperate climates, and most of those temperate climates are what we might call heating dominated. So it takes more energy to keep us warm in winter than it does to keep us cool in summer. So actually this starts to make a little bit of sense once we unpack it. From looking around at what I guess the existing literature was and trying to unpack this issue, colleagues and myself then undertook a small pilot study monitoring houses here in South Australia. So we had about maybe 20 houses in this sample, and I think the work was undertaken in 2017, so that winter and then into spring. So what we found from this monitoring work, so this is basically where we put a little temperature and humidity logger in the main living area of participants' homes. We found that for most of the time during winter, the conditions were below what you might call a minimum healthy indoor temperature. So the World Health Organization specifies 18 as the sort of threshold at which they can start to see adverse health impacts from temperature. This is though for healthy people. So for elderly, for very young people, people with issues, chronic health issues or other health issues, the temperature that is probably likely to be health supporting is higher than 18. But we use this temperature as a bit of a threshold in this research. So the other thing that this research showed us was, or started to unpack, was some of the attendant issues or the context in which people experience cold housing. So talking to these participants, understanding things like financial constraint, the impacts of having a cold home on their own health, but also their capacity to have people over and to socialise, the concerns about being able to pay bills, the sheer frustration or inability to be able to effectively heat as well, because the house was so poorly constructed. So it might be things like single glazing, very leaky building, no insulation. So there were a whole raft of issues that we began to see come out from this small pilot study in 2017. So from this work led on to another few studies, but the one that I really wanted to focus on next is this work that was funded by the NHMRC. So it was led by Professor Rebecca Bentley at the University of Melbourne and done with colleagues Professor Emma Baker from University of Adelaide and myself. So really in this work, we wanted to try and unpack the cold housing problem even more, but really get a better handle on its potential prevalence across Australia as well. So we know, there might be some issues, but how much do we really need to be concerned? So in winter of 2022, we sent out about 540 of the same data loggers to homes across the temperate climates in Australia. So we had about 100 households in each location, and that was Perth, Adelaide, Hobart, Melbourne and Sydney. So we sent people these loggers and instructions on where to locate them, and recorded temperatures in over 500 homes for that winter, and then collected all the loggers. So we had about 502 return. So this was the biggest data collection of indoor temperature conditions in winter that has happened in Australia to date. And what we found, again, was that these houses, by and large, were what we might think of as too cold. So about 80% of homes had an average temperature during winter of below 18 degrees. And then another way that we can look at this data is represented on the left-hand side of this slide, which shows that about 75% of the time across all homes, the temperatures were below 18 degrees, and that's indicated by the various shading of blue and purple. So what we really found from this is our previous estimates of the prevalence of cold housing might be vastly underestimating the extent of the problem. So our previous estimates were based on really the data that we had available. So the best data that we had was from things like secondary surveys like HILDA and other sort of population-based surveys. And that estimated, depending on what measure was used, that about 5% of households were affected. With this, we can see actually of this sample anyway, it's up to around 80% across these temperate climates. So the scale of the problem then becomes a lot more significant. Another thing that we did with this study and with a few previous others is then trying to look at, well, who's impacted the most? And with this study, the other thing that we were trying to do was to go, well, if we can't always collect temperature data or observe data, then what might be good proxy measures for cold housing? And this is what's represented on the screen. So this tells us a little bit about vulnerability, but also in terms of research, how we can use perhaps proxy measures. So people's own perception of whether their house is cold or not is a pretty good indication, as is the climate that they live in, indicated by heating degree days on the left-hand side. Other good indications are things like heating appliance. So we now know that people that have small electric heaters, while they're quite cheap to buy, they're a bit more expensive to run, they're much more likely to be living in a cold home. And we see the use of these types of heaters, particularly in sort of lower cost end of the housing market, where there's not fixed heating or air conditioning as standard in those houses. We can also see that people living alone are a lot more likely to be living in a cold home. And this can be, I guess, perhaps the financial constraints of having a single income household, but then also this sort of stoicism that we have. If it's just us at home, we might not be as likely to turn the heater on. The housing construction and quality is also an issue in cold housing. So older houses and houses with raised timber floors are more likely to be cold. So these indicators give us a bit of a sense of where we're seeing some of the concentration of these problems, but it also gives us a bit of a tool to be able to identify what homes might be too cold in winter when we can't actually use observed data. So I guess, why do we really care? Being cold at home, most of us have probably experienced it one winter or another. It's pretty miserable, but beyond that, it does have impacts to our health and well-being. So internationally, the research is fairly well developed, and it does show that there's physical and mental health impacts of living in cold temperatures. So the physical health impacts are things like impacts to our cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and others, and that can be, particularly problematic for people who already have issues with those systems or chronic disease. But it also impacts our mental health. So a couple of years ago, a group of us led by Professor Rebecca Bentley again, tried to start to quantify these health effects within the Australian context. And I'm pretty sure this is still one of the first papers to date that does this with Australian population. So there is, of course, more research out there from an international standpoint, but we really didn't have this type of research within the Australian context. So we used for this the Hilda survey data set, which I mentioned before. It's the Household Income and Labour Dynamics of Australia survey, and it's been going for about 25 years. So it's a pretty robust data set to be able to look at some of these issues. So we looked at basically the health impacts of being able to heat your home or unable to heat your home. And you can see in the graph on the side, the difference in the prevalence of different health conditions or health concerns by whether people can heat or are unable to adequately heat their home. And on the left-hand side, you can see that mental health is featuring quite highly there. And indeed, from this work, the clearest evidence came for the mental health impacts. So we found clear evidence that being unable to heat your home negatively impacted people's reporting of depression and or anxiety. We found some moderate evidence for high blood pressure and I think asthma as well, but it was not quite so clear when we did sort of robustness checks. But there is international evidence that does draw a clear line between cold housing and these physical health concerns as well. So we know being cold in our homes is not just an issue of being miserable or sucking it up. It does have these very wider health concerns. And there are groups of researchers as well who have done work looking to quantify the benefit of intervening and improving our homes so that they're not cold, and trying to quantify that in terms of health savings. And they are finding that through their simulation methods, we are able to achieve, I guess, hypothetical health savings if we bring people's homes up to a healthy temperature. So that work, some of the early work was led by Dr. Ankor Singh at University of Melbourne, and continuing on, it's been led in part by Professor Tony Blakely at University of Melbourne. So I guess, where does this take us? We have shown that we probably have a cold housing problem in Australia. It has impacts on our health and well-being. So I guess where do we stand in a policy or regulatory sense? I guess to start with, what our research has shown over a number of different projects is that building standards are quite low in Australia. So we have things like the National Construction Code for new homes. We have Residential Tenancies Acts, which help a little bit for the private rental sector. But in all, our standards are not where they need to be to try and bring our housing stock up to a healthy standard, I guess, or a standard that would support health, particularly in terms of cold housing. There's also issues, of course, that I haven't touched on very much in this talk, but things like cost of living crisis that are really compounding issues in here as well. So fewer people are going to be able to afford their electricity bill and heating. At the same time, particularly in the current climate, we're seeing issues of housing quality just not get so much airtime because there's so much discussion around housing demand. So, housing affordability, of course, the government's commitment under the Housing Accord to build all of these new homes within the next 5 years. And I guess somewhat concerningly from a research standpoint, and indeed many industry practitioners as well, is the pause on the National Construction Code and actually those standards for several years to help the construction industry achieve the housing supply targets under the Housing Accord. So I guess without going too much into that, it's to say that our regulation is really not where we need it to be if we want to see healthy homes across the whole of the housing stock. We also have a vast sort of existing housing stock where there's really no mechanism, aside from people's sort of private, I guess, aspirations, to retrofit things up to a certain standard. So things like retrofitting insulation or glazing or for air tightness. So we have that whole program of work that needs to be precipitated some way or another. So I think in all, while I would like to leave perhaps on a better note, I would say there's a lot more work still to be done in this area. So we certainly need, I think, perennially we're saying we need some better data. We need more consistent data so we can monitor these issues, as well as make the case about the health effects of cold housing more strongly. We need increased advocacy. So we need to be talking about, I guess, our concern about cold housing and what it means for people. And we also need to be thinking about how these issues play out under changing climate conditions. So while our warming climate does, I guess some people have framed it as, well, that's a benefit. Maybe cold housing is not so much of an issue. Unfortunately, we will see these issues persist for a long time. And we can also think about how our housing quality contributes to broader climate resilience to other climate exposures, perhaps like heat, flood, bushfire. So in this space, there's a lot more work still to be done, but I hope to be continuing this conversation, perhaps with many of you in the future. So my thanks again to you all, and my apologies for not being live with you today, and thanks Marley for again hosting this wonderful webinar. Thanks.
Excellent. So now we're moving on to our in-person speaker, Dr. Kimberley O'Sullivan, who will talk about overheating and cold housing effects on health and well-being. And just to give a bit of a bio before Kimberley starts, Kimberley is a Rutherford Discovery Fellow for her research program, Housing, Energy and Mental Health Wellbeing, or HOME for short, and a Senior Research Fellow of the Ki Kanga Aronga, sorry, I probably said that wrong, but please correct me, Kim, or the Housing and Health Research Group at the University of Otago, New Zealand. Kimberley's research explores the relationships between energy poverty, indoor temperature and thermal comfort, energy efficiency of housing and buildings, and impact on health. Her work is focused on understanding experiences of energy poverty among different risk groups and evaluating the health impacts of community, iwi, and government-led housing and energy hardship interventions. So welcome, Kim. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Marley, for the warm introduction and for the opportunity to join this great webinar today. I'm just going to set up with sharing my presentation and hope that I can find it here. I think that is now screen sharing, and hopefully everyone can see. Marley, pop in and tell me if you can't see, please. Otherwise,
It's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, great. I will keep going then. So yeah, thank you again, Marley, and it was really great to have such a fantastic introduction and overview given by Lyrian. And in many ways, I guess my talk is a bit of a reverse order of what Lyrian has been speaking about, because as we'll see, in New Zealand, we've kind of had the opposite understanding, where we've understood our homes to be very cold places, but actually, as we've started to dig into it, we've found that we are actually already experiencing some indoor overheating problems. So that's the work that I'll be talking about today. But just to start off, I'm going to take you on a short tour of some New Zealand housing. So here we've just got some kind of typical Wellington scene, and you can see there's quite a bit of variety of different housing styles, and some of them are a little more modern, perhaps down towards the bottom centre, and some much older homes in there as well. But we kind of have a bit of a progression of different kinds of homes that we have in New Zealand through different kind of building years and styles. So these are some from the 1880s, and then through the 1920s we moved from more villas to bungalow style homes. In the 30s, we had a kind of spread of Art Deco homes, and then the kinds of homes that we had once the state government started to get involved in building a large housing program post-war. We had many homes that were built to a kind of standard style. A lot of those homes have then been sold off over time, so it's difficult to tell just from looking at them whether they are still a government-owned home or whether they are now a private house, but many of them will be now private homes. We only have around, I think, 3.8% of public housing or social housing in New Zealand. So these are on the left, some more kind of 1970 homes. And then when we moved into the kind of early sort of 2000s, we've seen a lot of subdivision and a bunch of monolithic clad homes, which led to a whole host of leaky buildings problems. So if you're interested in building and building regulation problems, that's an interesting space to look into. And then more recently, we've seen an increase in kind of medium density housing and homes that are kind of up to 25 metres height, which is perhaps not what some places would call medium density, but in New Zealand, compared to very standalone homes that are typical, this is a much more denser style. So I guess coming to the research on overheating, we came there via our understanding that actually we have a lot of cold experienced in New Zealand homes, and that this is harming health. And a lot of this work was undertaken by my colleagues, led by Professor Philippa Howden-Chapman, who really did these two kind of seminal studies that demonstrated the effect of insulating homes and the effects of moving to an efficient home heating system from gas or unflued gas heaters or plug-in electric heaters. To majority of those homes moved to an air source heat pump. And so those studies were undertaken in 2007, 2008, or published in 2007, 2008. They were undertaken just prior to that. And so that was really provided the kind of gold standard evidence that, yes, too cold homes are harming health, but also what we can expect when we give some kind of minimal insulation is raising the temperature indoors by about 0.8 of a degree. If we install an efficient heater, we're also raising temperatures by around about 0.8 of a degree Celsius. So then we combine our kind of cold homes and our poor quality homes. As with Australia, we have quite low building standards. I think our current standard is roughly around about the equivalent of what Ireland's building code would have been about 40 years ago. So although we have moved up, we're not in any way kind of at a international best practice standard for new build housing. But on top of that, we've got increasing problems with energy poverty or energy hardship in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we have roughly about nearly a third of homes, if we include housing costs, spending twice the median expenditure on their household energy to power their homes. And that's the amount of money that they're spending on electricity and gas. It's not the amount of money that they need to spend to get their homes to that 18 degrees World Health Organization recommended healthy indoor temperature. And we can also see really clearly that our lowest income decile are spending proportionally much more of their income than our highest income homes. But so for every $1 out of $13 in New Zealand that they are spending, they are actually achieving a much lesser level of service than what the high income houses are achieving for 1 in every 77 of their dollars. So we have a huge disparity here as well. So a lot of the work that has been done here has been in trying to understand indoor temperatures. So we use, like with Lyrian's work, we have been using indoor environmental monitors, and we have really focused on understanding the kind of risks from cold indoor housing, cold temperatures indoors, and kind of very stark results that we have. So here's an example from a recent project. So this is from winter of 2023, I think it was, and this was for our work with the Ōtākou Energy Innovation Project, and these are real-time indoor temperature screenshots from monitors, and this was in the living room and bedroom of an older Māori woman who's living alone. So you can see at around between 7 and 9 in the morning, this was on a July winter morning, there was really nowhere warm to go in this home. So 4.6 degrees in the living room and 3.4 degrees in the bedroom, and also really high levels of humidity in this home as well. And so that is one of our extreme examples, but this is by no means a rare example across these kind of studies when we're undertaking them. So we do get some very low temperatures. But what my most recent work has been about understanding is actually, are we having a summer indoor temperature problem as well? And kind of while I've been undertaking research on this, we have seen I guess it would be fair to say, a bit of an explosion of media interest in this, and then also political interest in the issue of indoor overheating. And we can see that this is really starting to become an issue in the media. But the work that I've been doing over the last few years, funded by the Marsden Fund, for which I'm really grateful to be able to undertake some kind of initial qualitative work to point to this problem, has been to show that actually we are experiencing indoor overheating right across the country in not just new build homes, but in existing homes as well. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the results from these studies. So at first we undertook a postal survey. It was in the summer of 2021, 2022. So we sent a survey to regions where we thought that temperatures might increase in future. So we can see those on the screen there. We had around 36% of people responding. And we had not a great spread in terms of home ownership. We had more owners than private rental homes than we might expect. We also we did manage to get a fairly good level of Māori representation around about population level, and you can see about a third of our sample had children living in the home, and a third had older people living in our home as well. And what we could see from that data was that really, actually, almost everyone in New Zealand is already trying to take some action to cool their home during summer. And a lot of people were trying to use some passive cooling methods like, blinds or curtains, opening and shutting doors. But a lot of people had also moved to using active cooling. And one of our hypotheses was that because of the work of my colleagues demonstrating that efficient heating was so important, and that really led to, I guess, a really high market penetration of heat pumps. So now many homes have access to heat pumps, but that also provides a mechanism for using some air conditioning. If we use our heat pumps on air conditioning mode, we now have I guess, the ability to use more active cooling in our homes than ever before. So we wanted to find out, had there been a shift in the way that we were trying to cool our homes. And what we could see is that the cooling measures that people were using were only effective around half of the time. And for the people who said that their homes were often too hot, so over on the right, you can see the homes that were often too hot. When they are using cooling measures, you can see that they are much more often only sometimes or never effective. And whereas for the people that said on the left-hand side who said that their homes were usually about the right temperature in the summer, when they try to use their cooling methods, they're saying that they're almost always or often effective. So we can start to see some disparity going on here as well. Digging into this a little bit deeper, we can see that renters are far more affected by experienced overheating, Māori are more effective, and homes with children are more affected than homes without children. And then so kind of summarizing some of that work, we worked with a graphic artist to help us kind of draw some of these kind of big ideas and big results together. So we could see that actually almost 3/4 of respondents were experiencing some indoor overheating already, and that was summer 2021, 2022. And then we had some new building standards come in, so the more recent media conversation has kind of been, has that increased insulation, have those new building standards contributed to the indoor overheating problem? We had the minister asking questions about that, and both industry and the academic, I guess, community have come back to work with the ministry to say, actually, no, it's not about the standards being raised, it's about the kind of design of homes as well, having a lot more solar gain. And we can see that we have transitioned. People told us they had transitioned from using more kind of passive methods to active methods of cooling. So we're going to need to think about how we might cope with that in our energy system as well, because we're used to having a kind of winter peak of energy use in New Zealand, but we will eventually start to see more of a summer peak happening as well if we continue in this kind of trajectory. And what we're also seeing is that disparity is showing that while we had already identified that we had an energy poverty problem in the winter, we now have that same problem happening in the summer, and people are not so well able to recover from their high electricity bills during the summer. When we think about the well-being risks, here's a couple of papers that we've recently published if you're interested to go and find those. So the one on the left is some of the work that I just talked through, and then the one on the right is one led by my PhD student that is working with us, Jiting Chen, who's done some of these beautiful graphs that you're about to see. So in Jiting's paper, really we kind of dug more into the evidence that we had from that survey on the well-being and health and well-being impacts of experienced indoor overheating. And I guess it's useful to point out that we were calling this experienced indoor overheating because at that stage it was self-reported experience of overheating. But again, you know, overheating experienced by almost 3/4, and health impacts were reported by almost 2/3 of homes. And among the highest kind of described health impacts were sleeping difficulties and sleeping disruption, were affecting around half of the respondents. And a lot of people were also describing that their cooling methods were ineffective, and when we had a few qualitative responses, they particularly described that this didn't help them with sleep disruption, because if the air conditioning or the heat pump has been positioned in the living room and then the bedrooms are upstairs, this isn't really helping them to deal with this problem. So in terms of the kind of well-being impacts from that study, again, you can see here that more trouble sleeping is the kind of biggest ones. And then we have some kind of, I guess we would say, mood or indicators of some mental distress kind of came next in the list of priority problems that people were highlighting, whereas the kind of more physical issues perhaps, or physical health harm issues, were less of a problem but still very visible for people here. And we can also look at the rental versus owner-occupied and see the same disparity there that we mentioned before, the same with seeing disparity with Māori experiencing greater well-being impacts from indoor overheating than non-Māori, and also we found that women were more likely to report health impacts than men. Digging into some of these things a bit more, we've also done some work with some higher risk groups as well. So this one, which I'm just actually going to brush over quite quickly, was around looking at the impacts on disabled people. So we undertook some qualitative surveys to do this the next few pieces of work. So with disabled people, they kind of talked about just trying to make it through summer, and really talked about issues with trying to regulate temperature being really problematic for people that have physical or health challenges or disabilities that mean that they can't regulate temperature so easily. There was also a lot of talk about kind of navigating control over the home space, particularly when they're not the only person at home, and particularly if they were tenants. And also there were issues around access and inclusion for these people as well, when it came to kind of undertaking activities that would perhaps help them to manage indoor overheating. like accessing swimming or pools, and using public transport. They felt more housebound because they were less able to use public transport when it was very hot. We also are just starting to analyse some data from parents around how they keep their children cool. So again, this was a qualitative survey that we've undertaken. These are an example of some of the questions that we had asked, and we really wanted to get that kind of narratives around what did you do, what did your grandparents do, what did you do as a child, and now what are you doing, so that we can see if there are any shifts. And parents have kind of, on the whole, described methods for keeping their children cool, but then also barriers that they find in taking action to keep their children cool. And they are specifically talking about kind of how it affects their children's well-being and worrying about the indoor temperature and the health impacts that that might have, as well as highlighting cost and issues of access as well. Some very recent work is working with disabled tertiary students who are particularly vulnerable, and we've been asking them about their experiences of energy hardship. And I think this really highlights that, you know, the issues around is your house too cold during winter is actually being reflected as well with the same questions around is your house too hot in the summer. And again, we've found that there are kind of unmet needs in this group of people, and they have different requirements when it comes to trying to maintain a really even temperature. So for this group of people, they're particularly at risk, I think, from fluctuations in indoor temperature and not being able to manage that easily. And this kind of came through in different ways, and people talked about having sensory needs that meant that they need to maintain a fairly steady temperature that helps them to kind of regulate their function, particularly if they talked about having things like autism or other kind of sensory needs or disorders that I guess have more of a sensory component to them. Also, again, if they have any kind of chronic pain or pain issues, then having fluctuations in temperature was very difficult for them. And they also talked, interestingly, kind of about the cognitive load of needing to constantly look at their energy bills and weigh that up versus their needs for temperature controls. Moving to a group in public housing, again, we see when we ask people in winter, is your house colder than you would like? We see, you know, a very similar kind of response to whether people feel their house is too warm in the summer. So this idea that we've had a problem of cold housing in New Zealand and that overheating is not something that we need to worry about, I think is a real myth that we are now able to start busting with this new data. And this is some work that Tuting has been working on for her PhD, where she has undertaken monitoring of some public housing tenants' homes. And I think the interesting thing about this graph really is it shows that when people are able to use this is just a portable air conditioner, but so the two graphs on the bottom right, Alex and James, the light blue and the green, you can see those two homes spend much more time in the kind of underneath the comfort threshold, so they're maintaining much more comfortable temperatures than the homes that don't have any access to indoor portable air conditioners. However, there were some issues with those, and these we can see when we looked at the kind of things that people were trying to do. When it came to passive cooling, they were taking some action. So one person had actually painted out the windows, but that had some well-being impacts as well. The windows weren't opening wide enough, so natural ventilation is very challenging. But then when we moved to the homes where they were using some portable air conditioners, actually they were really expensive, and they were also finding that they needed to install it into the window and then take it off each time that they had finished using it, because they needed to then shut the window. And if it is windy, which I'm not sure if anybody from Wellington has joined us, but we experienced some extreme winds last night, some gusts of 130 k's around about where I live, so it was extremely windy. And while that usually happens in the spring and not so much in the summer or the winter, it's you know, it's a very windy place, and having a kind of temporary install in an open window and being several stories up, we didn't think that this was something that we could really recommend as a long-term solution. Again, there was a lot of focus on the impacts of health and well-being from this, and again, compromised sleep was something that's really being raised, mood and mental health, and also this kind of idea around just feeling less at home. So ontological security really being kind of threatened by limited access to thermal comfort, or a limited ability to achieve thermal comfort at home. And this is one of Chiting's very new and very beautiful new graphs, which is exciting. But so basically what we can look at here is when we are looking at some of the, so we had a lot of temperature monitors across a lot of projects now that have been installed for our work understanding cold indoor temperatures. But when we talk about, this is roughly around 500, between 500 and 600, sorry, I'm not sure of the exact number that went into this graph. But so when we look at just the summer months for these, we can see that actually there's a huge variety of temperatures that these homes are experiencing. So while we do have some very hot temperatures, and we have a lot of homes that are experiencing too hot temperatures, we also at the same time in the summer have a number of homes that are experiencing too cold temperatures, you know, underneath 12 degrees down this bottom threshold, the dotted line for the bottom threshold there. And another thing is we can also see with the relative humidity measurements here that there's actually a lot of kind of too wet homes still, and there are a few too dry homes as well. So really when we're looking at where do we want people's homes to be, we need to focus in on how do we get people into this kind of Goldilocks zone of healthy indoor temperatures, and how do we maintain that in the summer. And so kind of understanding and I guess figuring out the best way to retrofit our homes to meet that Goldilocks zone is where we will be turning our attention to next. So kind of balancing the different challenges and the different solutions that we have, and using real-time monitoring data, talking with people, doing some policy analysis, and then looking at weighing the different costs and different potential outcomes if we take these different options. That is the research that I think we need to be doing, and that we are looking to move towards in future. So ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much for having me and for your attention. Some contact details for you here, and I would also like to shout out to all of my funders, but also to my wonderful colleagues who have helped to put this presentation together. Thank you.
That was fascinating, Kim. Thank you. I especially loved the kind of key finding that overheating in housing isn't a monolithic, doesn't have a monolithic impact. It depends on who you are, what you need to do, your physical and your mental and your, I suppose, social needs. And I especially also loved that graphic design piece earlier on, which made what we know, that these kind of very dry academic pieces made it really real and tangible, and also quite beautiful. So I was very impressed by that. We have time for a couple of questions, but I might start with the ones that are directly related to this overheating idea. So we have one from an anonymous attendee asking, what are the best indicators for people living in housing of a hot housing problem?
Oh, yeah, I guess this is similar to what Marley was talking about before when she said that actually, I guess, looking at the different indicator questions that we can ask people. So I think what we can see is what people spend on electricity isn't a good indicator usually that they're experiencing a problem, and it's much better if we just ask them, is your house too hot during the summer or is your house too cold during the winter? And I would say that that question tends to be more useful than any other question. But I do think that we do need to do a little more work to kind of unpack and work on the correlation between our measured indoor temperatures and what we have had when we have self-reports of indoor overheating. So the initial work that we've done, we didn't have that data to match together, so that's kind of a next step for us. But I suspect it's around that. Do you feel your house is too hot during summer, sorry.
And I'll ask one more. So something we talk about a lot in Australia is being really envious of the healthy home standard in New Zealand. And someone's asked, has this affected the distribution of those indoor summer temperatures? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a really great question and something that would be really interesting to look at. What I can say about the healthy home standards is, while they are useful, it is quite easy to get an exemption from the healthy home standards. So if your home cannot be insulated because there's no access to there's no roof space to do insulation, or there's no access underneath the home, then you kind of meet the criteria because you've looked at it, you've tried it, and it can't be done. So, if we're thinking about how we might, whether those homes that meet the healthy home standard are not going to be affected by indoor overheating, I don't think we can really say just if you meet this standard, you're not going to have any problems from that. But yeah, another place where more work is needed.
That's devastating to hear. There's so many loopholes in.
Sorry to crush that dream.
I mean, it's good to get a healthy dose of realism as well. I think we're kind of reached the end of our time, but I suppose I wanted to really thank you, Kimberley, for coming and presenting. It was a very fascinating presentation, and also for all the attendees today. I was worried we might not have many people because it's spring has sprung, and sometimes we tend to think that the winter. Well, I tend to kind of go great. That's not our problem anymore, but obviously it is, and we know that overheating is just as important. So if anyone would like to sign up for information on future webinars or suggest ideas for future webinar topics, we'll be circulating a link to be added on to this list after the webinar. We'll also be sending out a recording of today's webinar for you to share with others who may find it interesting. We'll also share questions that were asked with Lyrian, and try and get the answers back to everyone. So thanks so much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day today.
Thank you, and thanks, Marley.